morning.
Good morning,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you for being here.
You've all introduced yourselves.
Yeah.
I feel sad I didn't get to say hello.
So Sarah, I'm looking forward to covering a lot of ground in the unfortunately short time we have this morning, but I'm sure we'll get there. We're going to talk about the payment sector itself.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the role of crypto. We're going to talk about your company, the outlook for Square, and I think also very important at the end, we'll talk a little bit about diversity in the tech space, which I know is an area that you're very interested in. But before we get into all of that, I know this is, as we just heard from Patty, this is something of a homecoming for you. Can you just tell us a little bit about how a girl from County Tyrone ended up being the CFO of one of the world's most exciting tech companies?
Sure, luck and madness and all of that. It is lovely to be home. Now having Square in Dublin with our European headquarters gives me a chance to actually come back fairly frequently, so that's been a nice thread. So I did grow up in County Tyrone in a little village called Sion Mills. I think the common thread, and please forgive my bad American accent, I'm totally aware of it, but it's unsolvable these days. The thread is tech, actually, because I didn't know it was tech at the time, but I always loved science in school and felt very supported in that. And that's actually, when we talk about diversity at the end, I feel very lucky that I grew up where, I was pushed in math and physics and chemistry and all of those subjects. I studied engineering, didn't have a great experience doing an internship in engineering. I actually did this mad internship in Ghana on a gold mine. Came back from that a little bit tail between my legs and headed into a world more of business. And that was kind of the shift over into what became more business, ultimately finance. But I was very blessed to spend 11 plus years as an equity research analyst getting to cover the tech sector and getting to see trends like the cloud coming about, for example, which I felt really passionate about. And then when I finally made that jump over into corporate life, did it via a strong mentor, Mark Benioff at Salesforce. Got to see Salesforce in part of its heady climb, and it's continued a heady climb. And then Square came calling, and it was kind of the perfect everything. It was finance, it was tech, it was people that I really wanted to work with. Jack's an amazing person and a great boss. And it also was very purpose-driven, which is something I've learned later in life, being able to match purpose, in our case, economic empowerment, to what you do every day, that kind of full speed that I am naturally, really brings it all together.
And given that Jack, of course, he has another big job that he has to do, that must be very interesting. You must get to do things that most CFOs ordinarily wouldn't do.
Yeah, Jack generally really pushes you to think outside your particular box. He wants you to be stretched. Like, I think I've been quoted many times saying my first performance review with Jack, which was a little awkward, but he was like, I just want you to be the best CFO in the world. I'm like, okay, well, that'll be easy. Just get going on that. So I have gotten to do, far beyond the traditional CFO purview. I've gotten to start products. I helped begin our Square Capital product, which is a lending product. So I know many of you in this audience are involved in the disruption around things like lending. So being able to use data to think about how do you get capital out to small businesses. So our average loan size in Square Capital in the US is about $6,000 to $7,000. And then today, I'm getting to redo that by running our Square Payroll product, which is our payroll product for the businesses that we work with to help them pay their employees, many of whom are hourly workers. And so I think there's a lot we can do for employers, but actually for employees too, to really change how payroll gets done, right? It's bizarro that we do payroll in batch processes every kind of twice a month. There's no reason for that.
So let's take that and sort of broaden it out a little bit. I'd like to talk a little bit about where you see the payment sector going. We saw, for example, PayPal last month buying iZettle. There's talk about Amazon getting into the person-to-person payments. Google is already there. You yourself have been making acquisitions. How do you see that space evolving, especially in terms of consolidation? Most tech sectors we've seen over time, essentially, we see one or maybe two big players emerging, and then everyone else is sort of battling for scraps. Do you see the payment sector going that way as well, or is there going to be a different trajectory?
So I think there's a lot of white space out there generally when you look at most fintech sectors. So where we began as a company with Square was really our co-founder, in fact, Jim, couldn't make a sale. So he hadn't been allowed on the system, so he couldn't accept the credit card. The person trying to buy his beautiful piece of art didn't have cash or a check, because those are still things in the US. I know the rest of the world has moved on. And so he lost the sale. And that was kind of the beginning for us of thinking about the payment sector, not just about disrupting what's there today and all that market cap and so on, but really thinking about a lot of the white space. And even today, 28 million small businesses in the US don't accept electronic payments. The UK, which is beginning to be a burgeoning market for us, 50% of small businesses don't accept payments. So I think there's just a mega trend to be able to shift people up onto electronic rails and to move into a much more cashless society. And it makes life much easier for consumers. It attaches a lot more data to the payment trail, because now you know not just what was bought, you know a lot about that thing. If I buy coffee, you know I buy it extra hot. You know I buy it every morning, probably between 7 and 8. You know what instrument I like to pay with. So you can actually know a lot of color and context about the whole payment, and when you put all that together, you can start to do some really interesting things with financial products around it.
But then, when you look at the space in 5 years' time, do you think there's going to be one or two big players, or do you think it's going to be as fragmented as it is now?
I think you will see continued consolidation, because there's a lot you can do at scale. So what I see with Square is, now that we are passing $70 billion across the system last year, we have access to data that has allowed us to do things like lending. It allows us to use machine learning to really bring specificity to you as the seller, because we're making use of all of the data of all the sellers that sit on the platform. So, in my kind of dream, you think about a seller who's opening up their business. We could help them think about what to price at. We could help them think about the discounts to put in place. We could help them in their supply chain know when to buy in bulk, when not to buy in bulk, because we know the pattern of their business, for example. So that would lend itself to say that over time there should be much more consolidation. I do think that there are cultural differences, right? The interesting thing about commerce is country by country, it's so different. And so you can kind of see the rise in Asia of the Alipay, WeChat Pay, right? Very different context from what's gone on in Europe to date. Much more a contactless-driven payments world, right? We see 70% of transactions in the UK are contactless, for example. And then you come back to the US, which huge GDP available to you, and yet still very old school in some ways in how payments are done. So big changes that I think can happen there.
I mean, Goldman Sachs, like Lloyd Blankfein likes to describe these days, Goldman Sachs as a tech company. How deeply do you think the big Wall Street banks understand the scale of the challenge that they're facing here?
Yeah, so if you look at the finance piece of fintech, it is a space that to date has not been very disrupted, right? If you go back and look at big chunks of the S&P, if I put an American context on it, right? The whole worlds of advertising and TV and entertainment and cutting the cable, right? All of that has dramatically shifted because of tech, right? The rise of Google, Netflix. In the world of retail, which I know well, looking at my 2 retail between Square and Walmart, the rise of Amazon. And so I do think that change is afoot right now in the financial world, and that the banks, it's always harder for the incumbents to truly disrupt, right? They tend to have come from, first of all, tech stacks that are older, so it's much harder to be nimble and quick-footed. For example, just on that point about access to data, like in many cases they're stitching together old systems, there's a lot of paper still in it, there's a lot of just people, sweat equity used to make things work. New companies, we get the benefit of modern systems. We build cohesively from the get-go. I think there's also just much more willingness to try things and do things differently. And I find when we work with the banks, it is slow going. Just getting an NDA signed can be like a 3-month extravaganza. I'm like, okay, this bodes well for the pace at which we're going to innovate around here. And then I think the final thing is just pools of profit, right? The banks make a lot of money out of things like debit accounts. So what we're seeing in the US as we really disrupt with our new Cash App product is we are creating effectively what feels like a bank account, but we don't have to, we're not charging you for the benefit of having it. We're not making you hold a minimum balance. We're not charging you for overdraft fees. We're giving you a loyalty program, which is almost unheard of in just a basic debit bank account. And so, because we're not held back by a profit pool that doesn't exist for us yet today.
So I'd like to focus now specifically on Square and your strategy. You recently bought web building site Weebly. Do you plan any more acquisitions in this space, or are you done for now?
No, we're absolutely always looking between build, buy, and partner. So maybe if I take a step back, Square, as I said, started with helping sellers never miss the sale. So our founder, Jim, we built originally around that payment piece. But if you look at what we think will drive our growth over the next several years, one is definitely the shift to omnichannel. So your buyer is showing up everywhere, whatever size of business you are. It's kind of been a myth that online and kind of omni is just for big businesses, because the reality is your customer is coming into your store. You may show up in their home. You have to be hyper-mobile. They may show up on your website if you have one, which is why we bought Weebly, because we wanted to be there when a digitally native company is formed. But it could be in an app. And in fact, for small businesses, it's rarely your app. It's usually a marketplace app. So think about Etsy, think about Amazon marketplaces, think about, in the event space, companies like Eventbrite. And so our goal is to build underneath. If it's going to be that online piece, that we will be the API platform underneath. If it's the offline world, we have our hardware, we're ready to go. In a world that's moving increasingly to software, we're building products that will do that too. So omni is big. Second piece is the disruption of financial services, and then thirdly, international, which our journey is really just starting from an international perspective.
And internationally, where do you see the biggest opportunities? Where do you see the biggest openings for you right now?
So if you're a commerce company, it definitely behooves you to follow GDP. So if you look at where we are today, US, Canada, Japan, UK, and then I would add Australia. It's a smaller GDP market, but it was a great testing ground for a disruption we wanted to do, where we wanted to use what's often called pin on glass, but where when you are in a chip and pin market for payments, the pin actually just goes into someone's phone rather than it being a separate device. And that was a very big disruptive shift that we've brought now to European markets. So from here, I think Europe is probably high on the list of where we'll look. But of course, we're not blind to what's going on in some of the emerging markets. India, Brazil, Mexico is always an interesting corridor when you sit in the US.
You didn't mention China.
China is a very different beast. And I think what to date you see going on with Alibaba and Financial, Alipay, and then WeChat Pay, I mean, it feels like a tough market, I think, for a more Western company to break into. But never say never.
What can you learn from them?
I think, watching what's gone on there, one is just the power of pushing an app to be ubiquitous. So when I look at Cash App, we're at 7 million monthly downloads or monthly actives today. We are the downloaded app in the App Store from a finance perspective, but we regularly now get into the top 15 downloaded free apps. And the question is, can we push in to be number 10? That starts to put you in really rarefied air. And there's clearly a network effect that kicks in, because that's what you've seen go on in China.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about crypto now, which I'm sure will be one of the hot topics in the bars and the cafes here this week. Your boss actually has repeatedly talked about the need for, he's a big fan of Bitcoin, he's talked about the internet's need for, deserves a native currency. And in November, in fact, you guys rolled out as your Cash App Bitcoin trading for your customers. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned about that since you set up Bitcoin trading?
Yeah, so If I take it, I'll start with the tactical and then end a little bit more strategic. So tactically speaking, what we could see going on in Cash App, we're usually driven at Square by the insights we see from our customers. What is it that they want to do with our product? We often call it the job that the product is doing. Not what we think they should do, but what are they actually showing us? And in the case of Bitcoin, we could see with Cash App, where we give you a card, a virtual card or a physical card, and become a card issuer, that people were using that to go buy cryptocurrency. So clearly, it's part of the zeitgeist of the moment, right? Crypto is top of mind. So we wanted to enable that. We felt as a payment innovator, I often get quoted as saying, at Square, there is no time for experiments or writing white papers. You're either all in and doing it, or you're not doing it. But you cannot persuade someone to kind of do it as a side project. And so with Bitcoin, as a payment innovator, I felt like we had to get there and really understand what it would mean to allow people to buy and sell it seamlessly. And so there's the tiny bit at the top of the iceberg that you all see if you've used Cash App in the US and can see how easy it is, frankly, to buy Bitcoin. But underneath, there's that huge unfold that is, how do we do this from a regulatory standpoint? How do we do it from a financial standpoint? How will it look? We're a public company, right? We have to be able to talk about it in our SEC filings. How are we looking at it from a risk perspective, right? There were a lot of teams that had to come together cross-functionally to make that actually roll out in the world. So thus far, we've seen interest, very much as more of a store of value, I would say today, not really as a currency yet. Strategically, kind of Jack's long-term vision, I agree with him. I think there will be some sort of global currency that doesn't have the downsides of fiat currency, right, where there's just a lot of friction as you go from country to country and make that exchange happen. There's a lot of value lost in the system. Frankly, what I get hot and bothered about is the very people that can't afford to pay all those fees. So if you think about corridors like US to Mexico, US to Philippines, US to India, you see it here in Europe, right back to Eastern Europe, for example, right, they pay a lot of money to send money back. And yet we live in a world of real-time systems where that shouldn't be the case. And so you asked about the banks. I just view it as profit pools that people have today that they are so protective of. But in some ways, they may be preying on the people who least can afford it. So if we can disrupt that, I'm always all in. How do we do that? I don't know if the answer is Bitcoin or just generally a much more seamless way to send money. But these are the things that keep us up at night when we're talking about the longer-term strategy for Square.
And do people store the Bitcoins with you or the cryptocurrencies with you, or is that held elsewhere?
No, we are cold. We are hot and cold. I've learned a lot about hot and cold storage over the last year. So yes, because that is part of the iceberg of learning how to do this safely and securely, right? Our brand is one of trust. We have a Net Promoter Score of over 70. It's a core part of how we go to market. So we have to make sure in everything that we do it with trust.
Then you must worry a lot also about the safety of that, because it seems like every other day we read about, it was over the week on Friday, I think there was news out of South Korea about one of the platforms had been hacked. You must think and spend a lot of money worrying about that.
I'm paid to worry.
Yeah.
If you met me, it's my job.
Because again, it's tied to your reputation as well, right?
The answer is yes, but we have risk in everything we do, right? When you move $70 billion a year and growing at 50% year over year, right? Everything that you do involves a lot of security. We say frequently, InfoSec or that piece of the business is not a destination, right? There's never an end point because the bad guys are always trying something new, trying to get smarter. And so I do believe we have a great team there, right? It behooves you to really go invest in the best engineers, the best data scientists to get that right. And they're always, on the leading edge. Like that pin on glass is a good example where they had to bring a lot of people with them to say being able to put someone's pin into a phone, just someone else's phone, is safe. So in the same way with crypto, we need to make sure that we keep those assets safe. And that involves both understanding hot storage, so when it's actually connected to the internet, but also how do you take it completely offline and make sure no one can hack into it.
And just one last question on that. Jack said last month at a conference that the move into crypto was very contentious within Square. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually going to be a good segue, I think, to your diversity question.
Yes.
So I firmly believe the way you make great decisions is by having diversity around the table and diversity of opinions. And in fact, we have a principle at Square when we say to build remarkable products starts by understanding a customer's struggle. So that's the point about making sure you're talking to your customers and understanding what job they want done and what they're using your product for. But they're also willing to take principled risk. And the two words are important. We want to be a company that continues to take risk, right? A lot of people fall under prospect theory, right? The more successful they become, actually, the less risk-taking they are, which is kind of it's a good brain teaser as to why that would be the case. And if you talk to Jack, his fear is always that we won't keep taking those bigger risks and we won't disrupt ourselves. However, we want to be principled about it and understand if we are taking a risk, why, and that we have actually weighed up the pros and the cons. So in the case of crypto, it was very much a decisioning around, on the one hand, we could see that customers wanted to be able to do this. We wanted to be a payment innovator. On the other side, the market is still forming. I think no one quite knows. It's been hyper volatile. We have a customer base that we don't want to be paternalistic or maternalistic towards, but we want to make sure we're protecting them, right? There a lot of US, we serve the underbanked. So we serve people who don't have a lot of money to begin with, and we want to be mindful of that. So there was a lot of good debate internally, and I think that is what gets you to a good decision, because otherwise, if everyone agrees, someone's not thinking.
Yeah.
So that never happens at Square.
Well, you mentioned diversity, and I think as a final sort of area to talk about, I think along with crypto, diversity in tech is one of the burning issues in the sector right now. And your numbers are particularly interesting to look at. I think half of the management team in Square are women, and about 60% of the firm report up to a woman. What's your secret?
Yeah, so we are proud.
Because you have finance, but it's both finance and tech.
Finance and tech.
It's like a double-edged problem.
The Venn diagram of women. There's like four of us in here. No. You see the other
laugh of recognition.
The other three women in the audience just laughed at that joke. So from a Square perspective, I'm definitely proud of where we stand, although there is a lot more work to do. And it's not just gender diversity. Frankly, I think there's a lot of work to do in all industries, but particularly in tech, around race and so forth. I think what's worked well for us has been not just diversity, but inclusion. So you can do all you want to hire people in, but if they arrive and it's not an inclusive environment and they don't feel like it's the place for them, it's like my experience of being on that gold mine in Ghana back in the day, they ain't staying. So it's just a great big leaky bucket of energy that is for naught. So really focusing on inclusion. We've done a lot of training around unconscious bias training, because there's definitely something systemic in there. So that's one strategy. And then the other, I think, is the role model piece, that when you do look up at Square, it is interesting to see, your CFO, actually the person who runs our largest group, what we call our seller team, but she's an engineer, Alyssa Henry, is amazing, probably one of the most senior engineers in Silicon Valley, so a woman. Our general counsel, our head of our Square Capital team, our head of people, right? There's a lot of women when you look up, so there's definite role models, right? It's not going to perfectly fit who you are, but at least you can pull pieces from their journey to maybe make that your journey. So that's the good. But I think just generally, fintech, tech, all industries, right? The numbers are terrible. We talked before we hopped on stage, but I am peeved on so many fronts. But the fact that 5% of the Fortune 500 has female CEOs, it's just not sensible that after all these years, there are 26 women out of 500 people leading companies, right? There has to be systemic bias. And I think just saying that it will get better with time, that has not proven to be a strategy worth pursuing. So I think we need to change strategies and perhaps be a little bit more, push harder to actually make it happen. And that's true for things like corporate boards, like all the places we can insert
what
more
would be your
diversity.
advice to someone in the audience here who's looking, manages, as a CEO of a firm and looks at the gender diversity, maybe it's 70% men?
Yeah.
Where do you, so you're in a very good position now, but let's say the tables were reversed. Let's say you had 70% men in your company. What would be your advice to someone to rectify that over the next few years?
I mean, you start with the stats that companies with more diverse management teams, more diverse boards, they just do better. It's like if I just told you that by doing something, your company would perform better, right? You'd all be running out to do whatever that thing is. So go get more women. And to do that, I think you have to sometimes really push, like, if you're hiring, it isn't, the Rooney Rule is something people talk about in the US, right? If you're hiring for a slot, always making sure you at least have one person from the minority group at least in the group being interviewed. I think that's crap because it frankly puts so much pressure on the one person that there's just no way I think they can get the job. So I think you're better off saying, I'm actually only going to interview, for example, if I want more women, I'm only going to interview women. And it's amazing how, like, when you work with your recruiters, they'll come back and they'll be like, oh, we just can't find any. I'm like, in the whole world, you can't find, like, a woman? Like, seriously? And it's, if you just keep pressing on them, because they'll want to bring you the great male candidates. And there are great men out there. This is not like that I hate men. I love you all. You're great. But it's like a push to say, no, I have a principle here, and I'm going to bring more diversity in, and I'm only going to interview women. And that way I can be sure at the end of this process I will have hired a woman. So you can take, I think, quite deliberate stands that feel aggressive, but I think at this point we need to be aggressive about it.
Well, I think that's a great rallying cry to start off this conference with. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us
You're
today.
welcome. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks.